Hey everybody, welcome to Ask the Pastor with J.D. Greear. I am your host, Matt Love. And this week we are continuing our Gospel and Politics series that we've been in for a few weeks now with a very special guest, Katie McCoy. Katie McCoy serves as the Director of Women's Ministry for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. She has a Ph.D. from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. She is an author of the book To Be a Woman. And today's conversation with Katie focuses on gender, sexuality, and what the Bible has to say about what it means to be a woman. So Katie's an awesome guest. This is a great topic. Let's go ahead and dive in with Pastor J.D. and Katie McCoy.
Katie, I really appreciate you joining me and assisting the people here at the Summit Church. Thanks for being with us.
So good to be with you all. Thanks so much, J.D.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about what you addressed in your book, the impact that transgenderism is having on our culture today, particularly on girls and young ladies. So I want to start out by acknowledging that this is a topic, okay, not to you, Katie, but to everybody listening, that is fraught with challenges. In fact, Katie and I were talking a little bit just off air a minute ago about how you kind of tense up, even when you've written a book on this, right? Where you're just like, okay, there's so many things that can be taken and twisted one way, and well, it's not exactly what I meant, and it's almost like you're trying to balance a pole on your fingers, and you're trying to always keep it right in the middle there. And so there's a lot of challenges, particularly for not just how we talk about, but when it thinks about families and how families respond to these issues and individual relationships. So Katie, help us understand how or why our society has arrived in such a tumultuous place when it comes to gender confusion. Basically, how did we get here?
Yeah, it feels like it happened overnight, doesn't it? Like all of a sudden there was this avalanche and it was out of control. The best analogy I can think of with it is imagine a big pot of soup. And into this soup, you're going to throw a bunch of ingredients and let them simmer and stew for a really long time. So there's several different factors and aspects of our world that have all combined to create the cultural moment that we're in. So some people might identify the beginning in 1996 when a group of transsexuals got together in Houston and they produced something called the International Bill of Gender Rights. And this kind of came and went. Nobody really paid much attention to it, but they said in their sort of manifesto that people have the right to define their own gender identity regardless of chromosomal sex, and they have the right to change their bodies cosmetically, chemically, and surgically, along with the right to enter into marital contracts and bear children. This was kind of a beginning of a strong initiative that took a full generation, and we're seeing the effects of it today. And along with that, this is all the overgrowth of what we could trace back to the sexual revolution of the 1960s, when you had the advent of the pill, abortion on demand. It essentially decoupled sexual relationships from any type of relational responsibility. So certainly marriage or any type of family commitment. Well, when that happened, the only thing that was left to determine whether a relationship was moral or not is consent. And once something is defined only by whether or not people can consent, then it doesn't really matter what the relationship is. It doesn't matter with whom it is. As long as they're two consenting people, you can't say that it's moral or immoral. Add to that, we had the gradual cultural acceptance of same-sex relationships, again reinforcing this idea that the physical body does not need to determine who you are, how you should express yourself, or certainly how you should direct your sexuality. Along with all of that, we have the rise of what Carl Trueman would call the psychologized self. And he talked about this in his recent works in the last few years, that the psychologized self is now preeminent. So it doesn't matter how you are created, the culture in which you were born, even your own physical body no longer has the right to tell you who you are. You are who you feel you are. And there's no one who has the right to disagree with that. Couple that with the broader worldview that we find ourselves in, a very big cultural moment that is, I would say, a reorientation of our own moral systems. So a friend pointed out that it doesn't feel like we're in postmodernism anymore because there's very definitely a right and wrong, and you've crossed over into wrong when you're canceled. We have a strong sense of morality, but it's misplaced or it's unhinged from any type of transcendent truth. Well, when you take away transcendent truth to guide whether something is right or wrong, good or bad, there's no overarching moral principle. The only thing that we're left with is power. And that's what we see happening today too. So all of this is this huge confluence of a lot of ideas that have funneled down. And here's why. Following the attack in Israel on October 7th, this Queers for Palestine sign you might have seen, it right. Seems so ridiculous because you're going, do they know they would be executed if they lived in a context like Palestine? It didn't have to make sense, though. It didn't have to make logical sense. It didn't have to make political sense. It just had to make sense in terms of identity politics. Because in our culture today, if you are part of what's called the majority culture or anything that would aid or abet it, you are a de facto oppressor. And if you are part of a minority, you are automatically oppressed. And here's where that worldview comes in, these worldview conversations, because like all worldviews, it's diagnosing a problem and it's prescribing a cure. Well, when you have a faulty diagnosis, you're going to have a faulty prescription for the cure. And so in our power-obsessed world, where there is no transcendent truth, there is no absolute right and wrong, the only thing that determines whether you are good or bad is whether you are in power or you are deprived of power, then if that's the diagnosis of the problem, what's the cure? We shake up that power dynamic. And this is part of why we see so much in gender ideology taking root today in different systems, whether that is law, corporations, public education, entertainment. It's not just a fad or a movement. It is part of an overall cultural mindset that is displacing what was the norm or the majority and replacing it or recentering a minority. This is also why I tell people, like, look, this is not a fleeting thing. We do not get to sit this out. This is not just a trend. Right. This is the overflow of deeply embedded ideas and ideas that have come home to roost. And then, of course, over all of this, the big why is the spiritual reason, because we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. The ideas and ideologies of our age are just the overflow of spiritual deception that we are encountering in the world. And we have an enemy who hates God, hates God's image bearers, and will stop at nothing to convince them that defying their creator and harming themselves is the true path to freedom. And all of that, you put all of that in this big pot of soup, let it simmer for a few decades. And that is the broad confusion that we have today over what it means not only to be a man or a woman, but to be human.
So basically you just gave us a recipe for how we got into the middle of the stew that we're in. That's an incredible image. So what is this, the rapid development? What is it specifically meant? Because I know that you've thought and written a lot about this for girls. Yes. What does it mean for them?
This is something that sociologists have been scratching their heads over to try to understand. And best we can tell, I think it is the exploitation of the girlness of girls. So teen girls especially, they are likely to identify with their peers. This is part of why there's such a connection among girls with that social contagion. In fact, one researcher found that if a girl's friend becomes trans identifying, that within about a year, she will as well. There was a group of about 3 or 4 high school girls, and they had this coach that they loved, female coach. And the female coach became transgender. And within about a year, all in this friend group did as well. So it's this way that God created women to empathize, to identify with, to enter into the feelings of someone else. And that is really being exploited by all of these different messages and ideologies. Couple that with the message that tells teen girls, if you don't really just have joy over being a young woman in puberty, maybe it's because you're in the wrong puberty. You were born in the wrong body. And I like to ask women, especially, who enjoyed puberty? It was awful. It was.
I will say I've never met a woman who looked back and says, yeah, my 7th and 8th grade years were awesome.
Yeah. Who wants to relive them? The queen bees and wannabes, all of that. Like it was a season of life that we all had to get through. Yeah. But now it's essentially being pathologized to say that if you don't enjoy being a young woman through puberty, well, then we can just quite literally give you something to stop that, to arrest your puberty, called puberty blockers. And these are drugs, by the way, that were created to heal. They were created to arrest aggressive forms of hormone cancer. And that would allow the patient, the cancer patient, to have more of a fighting chance. Well, doctors started prescribing them off-label. We're still learning about the effects. Everything from brain swelling to greater risk of stroke, bone density loss. There are young women in their 20s who have the skeletal system of an octogenarian woman, teeth cracking, all of these things. And even more of a disservice to these young girls, puberty for a gender-confused child is the most clarifying season in which the child will realign to the gender identity that corresponds with her biological sex. And so by medicating it away, doctors are medicating away what had something between an 80 and 90% success rate of helping clarify a child's sense of self. And so all of these things are exploiting girls. And then along with that, we cannot fail to talk about the correlation between sudden trans identity and sexual abuse or sexual harassment. I've lost count of how many stories of young women suddenly thought there was safety in being a boy, that it's just not a safe world to be a girl. And it becomes almost a form of psychological survival that if I were a boy, I wouldn't be hurt. And one therapist, she did this remarkable congressional testimony a few months ago, and she found something like 70 to 80% of adults who are transgender, they had some form of sexual abuse in their childhood.
Wow.
And so it shouldn't surprise us what we're learning more and more on these statistics about sexual abuse of children. And they stumble onto TikTok, Instagram, these trans influencers, and they find, well, here's why you don't feel at ease within yourself. Here's why you feel such inner angst and distress and feel out of place in your own body. It's because you were born in the wrong body. And so this is a very dire need to address holistically. And it doesn't help that media is censoring a lot of these things too. That's a whole separate conversation. But
wow. Well,
there.
Yeah. I mean, because going back to what you said earlier, how like the new regime has its own version of excommunication, and that's called canceling.
Yep. And
it's every bit as devastating as the old excommunication. And it also has its ways, like a totalitarian regime, of controlling the conversation, which is what, you look back on the supposed dark ages, and, the church is controlling and keeping science from speaking and dictating that, whether or not that's an accurate read on that period or not, you definitely have that same kind of fundamentalist mentality today that's keeping the conversation going along certain lines, and thou shalt not deviate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what, let me just shift it just a tad here. When we're thinking about this, like you've taught, I remember this was in your book. You said that gender or female identity in particular is both a biological and a theological reality. Could you just unpack that for a minute when you talk in those two categories? What does that mean?
Yeah. So our gender is biologically determined. Our bodies essentially tell us who we are. But along with that, it's theologically bestowed. We don't choose it. It's given to us. And it's for the purpose, like all of our humanity is ultimately for the purpose of connecting with and reflecting our Creator, both individually and in relationship. This is where we have such an opportunity to talk about the beauty and the wonder and the complexity of what it means to be humanity created as male or female, because the Hebrew emphasis on it, and I'm about to throw a bit of a grenade out that could be really misunderstood, but the Hebrew emphasis on gender difference is relationality, or the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And more of a Greek understanding of gender difference is more in terms of hierarchy. And one of the ways that we in the Western church have allowed our theology to be influenced more by Greek thinkers than Hebrew theologians or Hebrew thought is we've embraced this sense of hierarchy as opposed to relationality. In other words, connecting with someone face to face, which is that picture in Genesis 2, helper corresponding to him, that face to face understanding the self through understanding the other. And so there is that self-confrontation. You see both who you are and who you are not. And like all aspects of what it means to be in the image of God, we don't have just one verse or one definition of what it means to be in the image of God. We don't have just one aspect of what it means to be a man or a woman. It is not less than the body, but it's more than the body. There's a relational character to it. And so as human beings, we are individually created in God's image. I am no less of a person because I'm not married. And yet, if I were in a marriage relationship, it's the only time where the math goes 1 + 1 = 1, because I then become part of a completely new united whole, retaining my personhood as an individual, but then part of a relationship in which two become one. And this too is a reflection of the God in whose image we were made. We have a God who has 3 persons and yet is one God. And so this is an aspect of the way that we reflect who God is in both unity, diversity, complex whole. We can't exactly divide him without ending up doing a disservice to the definition of the oneness of God. And even though it's not the same, the only analogy we have in scripture for man and woman is the analogy between Christ and the church. What we do have in the creation of humanity is 2 equal beings who are both individual persons and yet together create yet a different individual unit. And so I might be saying that a little cumbersome, but this is part of what it means to be created male or female. And this relationality, it's not limited to marriage. It finds its fullness in marriage. We find that in Genesis 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. But who I am as a woman is something that I express in all of my relationships according to what those relationships are. And so I don't know if I'm kind of talking around in circles with that a bit.
No, that's actually very helpful. I actually never heard those categories like that. That's super helpful. Shift gears again, getting to the question of, just like the practical issues of the day where we are. When we think about things like the debates about public restrooms, women's sports, should men who have transition be able to participate in those, some of the battles over public school curriculum. Could you just give us a quick overview of where things are and how faithful Christians can and should respond to those questions?
Yeah, it's really, if it seems like it's everywhere, it's only because it is. So it has reached every aspect of our society. So the issue of, let's start with women's restrooms or locker rooms. The issue there is, do females have a right to sex-specific public spaces or sex-specific spaces? And this is something that feminism has sort of kind of devoured itself. And it's a bit ironic because in second wave feminism, the argument was, if you are born a woman, then you are de facto oppressed and you are a gender minority and we need to protect this gender minority. Well, now there is essentially a new gender minority, and that is trans women as biological men who identify as women, and they are demanding to be accepted into female public spaces, whether that is bathrooms or locker rooms. Now, I always want to be careful here and note that not every man who is wanting access to these spaces is a predator. But we would be blind. We would be burying our heads in the sand if we did not acknowledge that many are. And this also opens us up to a very uncomfortable aspect of trans ideology, and that is something called autogynephilia. I write about this in the book. And it's essentially a form of, it's a sexual fetish in which a man is sexually aroused by the idea of appearing as a woman or living as a woman or even having feminine biological processes. And so this is something that sociologists who have no conservative leanings, certainly not a Christian background, they are coming out saying, a lot of these men who suddenly want to be women, they're not really transgender, they're autogynephilic. That also is important because they've not left a heterosexual attraction. So giving men access to these spaces, it has become almost representative of the issue of trans equality, but you can go online and find no small anger of biological men who are demanding to have access to women's locker rooms and bathrooms. So someone did a deep dive one time of Leah Thomas, the swimmer, and looked at his Instagram profile and found evidence that by his Instagram likes and accounts and things that he would post, that this is likely an autogynephilic man. Where this also gets even more alarming is when it extends to things like domestic abuse shelters or rape crisis centers. Does a biological man who is presenting himself as a woman have a right to those spaces as well, especially knowing how it would cause intense psychological distress for women? In California, as it is in the UK, biological men can claim to be women and have access to female prisons. That is happening in California. And so women are living in...
That's happening there. Our governor here in this state told me that that's an issue in North Carolina. Now, I don't think we're in the place they are in terms of allowing the access, but he says that they have had a flood of requests of people that are trying to get into women's prisons as transitioned men.
Yeah, as trans. Yeah, and there's a woman who, she was formerly incarcerated. She's a Christian, has an incredible ministry to incarcerated women, and is sounding the alarm on this and saying, talked about how there was a man who essentially harmed himself, mutilated himself in order to try to get access to a female prison. And this was a registered sex offender. And so in the name of gender equality, you have an entire segment of really half the population who now has to take a back seat to these biological men who claim to be women. Now, that's the predatory angle.
Right.
The indoctrination angle is a little more subtle. That is especially prominent in education and entertainment, specifically children's education and entertainment. Sesame Street is no longer a safe place. You've got to screen Sesame Street. Blue's Clues. There were these little cartoons that featured double mastectomy scars. This is for 4 and 5-year-olds, and it's introducing them to these concepts. A friend of mine took a video of this children's book. She flipped through it, brought her 4-year-old daughter to the children's library, and it was a story of Bunny Bear. And Bunny Bear is born a bear, looks like a bear, but he feels like a bunny. And he wants to move in to where the bunnies live. And isn't it so wrong that the bunnies don't accept the bear, even though he feels like a bear or feels like a bunny, wants to be a bunny just because he looks like a bear? Well, this is a trans ideology.
I couldn't think of a better analogy to depict my hesitation with the whole process. I think the bunnies are probably smart to not allow the bear.
Right, exactly.
So anyway, I don't want to go too far.
Exactly. But see, there it is. This bear is, big, hefty, strong bear demanding to live in the little bunnies' spaces. Well, what is that? That is men in women's social spaces. And this is introducing children to these concepts. Now, that shouldn't be a huge surprise, because if you're going to completely change public perception, you start at preschool.
Yeah. In fact, I don't mean to interrupt you, Katie, but I was going to say, like as a parent, I've got young kids and I'm always trying to pay attention to what they watch. And I'm actually really grateful for a lot of the labeling that tells me, hey, there's rough language in this. Mm-hmm. Hey, there's violence, sexual stuff in there. But what I've noticed is that overtly trans and gay stuff, it very rarely will show up in those ratings. It's almost treated like it's a good thing. Yeah. My kids, they were watching the show and it was a great show. It was, the language was kept at a minimum and there wasn't a lot of violence, a lot of sex, but people talked about, that transition as if like, well, it's just like talking about honesty or, kindness. We're also talking about this kind of toleration, and it's part of the moral, disagreement with that is outside of the Overton window. And you got to be aware of that.
Exactly. Because this is treated as helping children embrace and create a more tolerant world. Because the thing that essentially people want you to believe is there are so many transgender people all throughout our population. They just haven't felt safe enough to disclose who they are. And I think it was Abigail Schreier who wrote, Irreversible Damage. She said, well, then where are all the 40, 50, 60-year-old trans people? How come they haven't come out of the woodwork? It's a great question.
Yeah. Wow.
This is socially influenced. And part of how it's socially influenced is introducing children to these concepts, such as education curricula that will say, when you're born, mommies and daddies and doctors, they don't really know if you're a boy or a girl. So they just look at your body and they guess. But only you know if you're really a boy or a girl. Mm. And children are imaginative and they're kids. They can't possibly understand. And so you have parents just thinking, oh, my child is so advanced that he or she understands that he's trans. There's a doctor out in San Francisco, which is like, of course, San Francisco. But she said, if your daughter is trying to pull barrettes out of her hair, it's not because she's uncomfortable. It's not because she's fussy. It's because she's sending you a gender message that she, as a 3-year-old, understands that she's actually a boy and should not be wearing barrettes. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of stuff that it sounds insane, but there are whole mindsets crafted around it and delivered in age-appropriate ways. Right.
And parents would want to be wise to those things. What about, Katie, in particular, the person going to work and is now being presented with someone who says, hey, I've transitioned. I was Julie. Now I'm Julius. And I want you to call me he now instead of she. Mm-hmm. What does a faithful Christian do in that kind of world? How do we think about the pronoun issue?
I think this is tough because we don't have old dead guys to consult. We are, unless the Lord comes back, we are going to be the old dead guys that were writing about this and figuring it out. So I have a lot of grace in my heart for people who will see this differently based on conviction. So let me give a caveat first. I think wherever you land on this, you should do it out of conviction and not out of fear. And that can be fear of backlash from people in our world. And it can be, frankly, fear of backlash from people in our own camp.
Wow. Well said. Because
sadly, there's not enough grace given for people who are trying to figure out a way to be faithful Christians on that. And I can't tell you how often I'll hear people, I'll substantively agree with what they're saying, but I just think, I think the spirit is the spirit of that really kind of misses the mark in my view. So I'll tell you my approach. I will use the name that someone gives me. We go by nicknames. People can even legally change their names. So I'll use the name someone gives me, and I try to avoid the pronouns. And if I was really backed into a corner, I would have to say, I feel like I'm going to have to choose between offending you and offending my God. And if you are a tolerant person, as I hope you are, then I would hope that you wouldn't expect or demand me to do that. Mm-hmm. So are you a tolerant person? If you are, then can you tolerate that I cannot, based on conviction, call you something that does not correspond to reality. Now, let's back up though and think about this question of pronouns in a worldview framework. We live in a society that views language not as reflecting reality, but creating reality. That if you say you're a man, you're a man. If you say you're a woman, you're a woman. If you say you're a cat, you're a cat. That's not a leap, by the way. That's happening too.
Oh, I know. Yes, I've seen the TikTok.
Yeah, it's just the next step. So if we live in a world where language, reality is determined by what I will it to be and my words, who but God alone can create reality by his will and his words? Mm. So this is one of the ways that, and I don't mean this to sound as strident as perhaps it might, but it's one of the many ways that gender ideology is just another form of idolatry. Mm. It's that I can decide by my will and by my words who I am and what reality is. And not only that, but I have the right to demand that you conform to my view of myself and my reality. It is a collision of a lot of worldviews. And on that basis, I believe Christians have an opportunity for a very uncomfortable witness. And it will put a lot of us in some difficult situations, potentially. Now, I'm also of the belief that the reason so much of this has occurred for the sake of a fraction of a percent of the population is because people don't speak up and say, that's ridiculous. I'm just not doing that. I will speak to someone with respect. But if you're asking me to do something that is against my conscience, I just draw the line there. And when enough people will do that, it will become unprofitable. That's just a part of our society. It's part of why we see corporations falling all over themselves to incorporate trans marketing, is because ultimately, why are they doing it? They have a bottom line. They think this is good for that. Right. And so when enough people push back, they'll adapt.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot of wisdom there, Katie. I feel like I'm on that issue because as a pastor of people, trying to guide them in ways that are faithful and workable, and telling them, we are compelled to speak with truth when that's unpopular. And it may, we've had the privilege of being in a country where, for the most part, operating with our Christian convictions has not led to loss of job and imprisonment in most cases. But, that may change. But the fact that we were in that season made us historically an anomaly, because most Christians and most generations had to face that in some way. And so we shouldn't be surprised. At the same time, I appreciate what you acknowledged at the beginning, that there is a little bit of, what does it mean to be in relationship with somebody in the conversation? You exercise some of it yourself. You're like, rather than wage the war with them every third sentence, I'm just going to use their name instead of the pronoun. Mm-hmm. That's relational wisdom of saying, hey, is there a mutual ground we can find here? It's, I've heard somebody say before, I like this phrasing, the question of whether or not we use someone's preferred pronoun, if it's different than their biological sex, the answer to that begins and ends with no. In the middle, I've got some relational wisdom, and that's a little bit that area where you were talking about, like, hey, let's give each other, let's wait till we're all old dead guys, and then we'll trust everything we have to say on it. So I just so appreciate your spirit in it. Let me give this the last question here. I've actually taken this probably a little longer than I should have, but what resources would you point us to that? And I've already mentioned yours, and I would say that's a great place to start. But what else would you point us to?
Yeah, thank you. So Andrew Walker is a professor at Southern Seminary. He wrote a book, God in the Transgender Debate, and he covers some really practical things like bathrooms, camps. I've gone to more churches now where I'm seeing bathrooms that are just a single person. And I hope maybe we'll have more of those, because people are asking really genuine, practical questions. Like, what do we do if someone has a preferred gender that they want to use a bathroom that doesn't fit with their biological sex, and we want to minister to them? That's a really valid question. Sleepaway camps, that's another one that people have to think through of, like, what do we do in a situation where there's perhaps like a student camp. So that's a great book. Ryan Anderson's When Harry Became Sally. And that title is it just always will make you chuckle, When Harry Became Sally. And he really gives not only a lot of historical background, he's a Catholic thinker, very sound. And then also Miriam Grossman, she is a psychologist, and she just wrote a book in the last 6 months or so called Transnation, Lost in Transnation. So she's looking at it from the psychological perspective. And then, JD, can I end with this one thing? Because I feel like there's such an opportunity that we have for the gospel with all of this gender confusion, that when you really hear a gender dysphoric person talk about what they're looking for, they're saying things like, there's something wrong with me. I was born with it, and I need to be made into a new person. Could we ask for a better tee up from the Holy Spirit to sharing the gospel? To say, yes, there is something wrong with you, and you were born with it, and you do need to be made a new person. But this is something that no shot can give you and no surgeon can reach. You need new birth. And until you're reconciled with your Creator, you will never feel at ease and peace within yourself. I think we need to listen to our detrans Christian brothers and sisters, people who came to Christ and then detransitioned, or they detransitioned and in the process of that found the Lord. And they are giving us some of the not only most powerful testimonies of how the Holy Spirit is not bound by any challenge culturally, ideologically, medically that we have today. And then also great warnings for us and how we should minister to people in our culture today who are caught up in this era of gender confusion. Yeah,
that's amazing. And the only one I'll add to that is you referenced it. Carl Trueman's got a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Isn't that right? And then there's an easier to read version of it. Do you remember the name of that one?
Yes. Strange New World.
Strange New World. It's great if you're just kind of like, hey, I don't know about the 400-page one. It's a great one. So, Katie, you are a Dr. McCoy. I'll call you that finally. You are a gift to the church, and I hope that you will continue to write lots and lots and lots of books and speak, because I feel like I'm fairly well read on this subject, but I just learned more in the last half hour than I think I have in the last 3 years on this. So I appreciate your wisdom and your spirit that you share it with.
J.D., thank you for your ministry as well.
All right. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. Next week, we're going to continue this series, and we're actually going to hear from one of our Summit Church's own members, Brooke Medina. So we're really excited about that. She's going to be sharing a little bit and having a conversation with Pastor J.D. as we continue this Gospel and Politics series. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Go straight to your phone. Or we're recording this on YouTube. We started saying this last year. We're posting all these. So if you want to watch these on YouTube, you can subscribe at j.d.greear. And we will see you next time on Ask the Pastor.